So, the former deputy minister of energy for Russia, Vladimir Milov, published his thoughts on the effects sanctions are having on Russia. And there's this widespread belief that Western sanctions on Russia had fallen flat, and he kind of argues against this. He falls in the same line with me that sanctions are working, it just takes time and we need to be patient. Now, many people in my comments, in the media, will point to this theory that the sanctions have fallen flat because economic indicators such as their GDP, the strength of their currency, unemployment rate, etc., are still resilient and they're still not where we would want them to be. Critics also of my line of thinking that sanctions are working are also saying that it hasn't had any effect on the war. Putin continues on the war. Well, those are two separate things. I mean, Putin is showing that he will take his people to the brink of potential destruction to meet his ends in Ukraine, and while also lying about the numbers and kind of fudging the statistics a bit when it comes to the sanctions and what the war in Ukraine has done to Russia. And a lot of the arguments that these people that are countering what I'm saying, what Vladimir Milov is saying, are misguided in their thoughts and how they account for what is taking place, instead just giving the headline overview without really looking at the data and what the underlying issues are. So before I get into that data, we have to understand that Russia economically has been preparing for this war. They were aware that sanctions likely were going to come. I don't think they expected them to be as strong as they are, but they experienced sanctions after the Crimean War in 2014 and went down a path to prepare. They increased trade with Asia. They hoarded huge amounts of Western currencies so that they could still operate in those, even if it means in the black market. Putin strengthened his repressive machine in order to deter mass protests against the deteriorating living standards. So we couldn't expect that the sanctions would work immediately. The Russians get a vote in this, and they took steps, but it doesn't mean that the sanctions aren't working, and it doesn't mean that the things aren't going to get worse for Russia in the future. The idea that Putin's regime was going to disintegrate under sanctions was a bit utopian for those of us that support Ukraine. Putin invested significant resources in his disinformation campaign. So as bad as sanctions can be, as long as he can keep the people believing that everything is all right and misleading Western policymakers, misleading his people of the real effects of the sanctions, he continues to remain relatively strong. But that doesn't mean that these sanctions aren't hobbling the Russian economy, which they absolutely are. So this idea that Russia has shown resilience comes from some indicators, and I'll talk about each of them. The first of which is the strength of the ruble. The second is the unemployment rate. The third is their GDP, and then also some of their trade and other things, and not necessarily in that order. I'll talk about those in different orders and whatnot, but the idea is that many people say that those all still remain strong. So take unemployment first. Russia is reporting that their unemployment is at a record low. That's 3.7%. Only 2.7 million Russians are unemployed. That's incredible given what's going on. It's actually too incredible because Russia fudges their numbers on how they report their unemployment rate. The reality is at the end of the third quarter in 2022, almost 5 million Russian workers were subjected to what's called hidden unemployment. 70% of those in hidden unemployment were on unpaid leave, meaning they were still in a job, in a position on paper, but in an unpaid leave status. So what's the difference to the average worker if you're in an unpaid leave status and versus unemployed? Nothing. You're not getting paid. You're not contributing to the economy. You're not working. But it allows the Russian government to say, oh, our unemployment rate is only 3.7%, when in reality it's closer to probably 10% of the Russian workforce is just not working at all. This is the worst level that Russia's seen since the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the Russians experienced 10 to 13% unemployment. And this unemployment rate could go up as sanctions continue to bite, as the price caps continue to hurt them, and the war effort goes on within Russia. Another misleading statistic that I see a lot in my comments is how strong the ruble is. Now, the ruble is technically on paper strong relative to where it was at the beginning of the war, but this is only because of massive government interventions from the Russian government. They locked down the ability to sell the ruble internally, thus meaning people can't get rid of it. So if they were to open up the market on the ruble completely, as if it were like the dollar, which is a completely open market currency, people would sell it en masse, and the ruble would take a nosedive. It would be a bad situation for Russia, which is why they're not allowing that to happen. In addition, their imports to exports are out of balance. They're not importing a lot because sanctions. So they're still exporting though, and their exports are being paid in rubles. So people need to buy rubles to pay Russia to purchase things like oil and stuff like that from Russia, natural gas, which is propping up the ruble. Again, if they were to be able to have open trade with the sanctioned nations, such as in Europe, the ruble would drop because the Russians would need to sell the ruble to get euros or dollars, etc. But that's not the case. And because of that, the demand for ruble is higher than the supply. And when there's a higher demand with a lower supply, it means that the price goes up. Now, this is actually hurting Russia in other ways, specifically in their steelmaking sector, which requires cross-border trade. And because of the strong ruble, people have seen that steel coming out of Russia is more expensive, and it's contracted the Russian steel industry by 7%. The other indicator is the GDP. People have said that, the GDP is going to plunge by like 9% and it's going to be terrible for Russia. Well, in reality, the GDP has dropped by 2.7% on paper. Still a recessionary action, but not as terrible as people would have said. But the reality is a lot of this GDP is being propped up by military industry, which is kind of cranked up within Russia. Now, the difference between military industry as a GDP indicator for the U.S. versus for Russia is the U.S. gets value out of its military equipment over time, whereas Russia is currently producing things like battle tanks that get sent to the front line but then get destroyed by a Ukrainian Javelin, and it counts as a contribution to the GDP but really provides no value because it's just a hunk of metal in Ukraine. So not a great indicator as well. If there was no war currently going on in Ukraine, Russia's GDP would actually probably be positive, but also if there was still a war but they weren't producing military equipment, it would be much less, like probably in the span of like 7 to 9%, which is a huge, that's like depression level declines. When you look at trade specifically, you see that outside of energy and gas, this is a huge indicator as to how sanctions are functioning. Anything that Russia manufactures is essentially gone to shit when it comes to trade outside of Russia and its allies. The output of the Russian automotive industry, which provides jobs for 3.5 million people in Russia, has plummeted by 2/3. A lot of this is because they just don't have access to Western tech. So the reality is it's a bad situation for Russia, but it's all being suppressed and hidden. And they do the same thing with inflation. Inflation, according to the Russian central bank, is around 16%. This is widely known. But the Kremlin is reporting to its people and to Western nations that it's only 12%. That's still pretty high, but that 4% gap is the difference between, well, this sucks and this is a massive emergency. And 16% is what we're looking at. This is affecting the people on the ground in Russia. And because of that, the Russian Public Opinion Research Center said that 35% of Russians are forced to cut their spending on food in 2022. Cut their spending on food while seeing an increase in the cost of food means that people are not getting all of the food that they normally wanted. Again, although the public opinion is turning on Putin, he has apparatuses in place to manage that so that he is very strong in maintaining dissent or controlling the dissent. How long? I don't know. Now, the issue is the sanctions are working. It's just going to take time. And Russia has buffered itself against this. They are an energy producer and exporter, so that's going to prop them up as well. But over time, the things that they need to just function as a society, which is not just selling oil and gas, they're going to lose access to completely, and that system is going to collapse. I fully believe that's going to happen at least this year. if not early next